The woman known to history as Eleanor Roosevelt was born on the 11th of October, 1884, in Manhattan, New York, the eldest child of Anna Rebecca Hall and Elliot Bullock Roosevelt. Both of her parents came from exceptionally wealthy and privileged socialite families. Despite her family's wealth and status, much of Eleanor's childhood was difficult, painful, and lonely. Her mother, Anna, maintained an emotional distance from her daughter and was often critical of her physical appearance, lamenting Eleanor's supposedly plain features and calling her Granny, a teaser for her solemn and serious manner. Eleanor's paternal aunt, Anna Roosevelt, known as Bammy, also looked upon her with disappointed pity, remarking that her niece was much too tall and that her lips and teeth were too large to make her a beauty. Such talk seems harsh to the modern observer, especially since all photographic evidence indicates that the young Eleanor was in fact a lovely girl. This kind of open criticism of a female child reveals the limited positions and opportunities open even to aristocratic women of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, who were not expected to do much more than marry well and raise children. In such a case, a girl perceived as cheerful, vivacious, and pretty, according to the conventions of the day, would almost certainly marry better than a so-called plain and serious one. Eleanor also had a complicated relationship with her father, Elliot, whom she loved dearly. However, his struggle with alcoholism meant that he was frequently absent during her childhood. When Eleanor was 8 years old, her mother died of diphtheria. Less than a year later, the same disease took her younger brother, Elliot Jr. When Eleanor was 10, her father fell through a window during a bout of delirium tremens and within 2 days died of a subsequent seizure, leaving Eleanor and her brother Hall orphaned. Eleanor and Hall went to live with their maternal grandmother in Tivoli, New York, where they cleaved closely to one another. Their relationship remained close throughout their lives, and Eleanor always tried to act toward her brother as a mother might. Nonetheless, she spent her early adolescence frequently lonely and depressed. Even though the house was full of relatives, Eleanor found little warmth among them and was deeply intimidated. Her grandmother and aunt were stern and forbidding. Her maternal uncles, like her late father, were deep in the clutches of alcohol, and their behavior was just as erratic. Her paternal uncle, the charismatic Theodore Roosevelt, was always kind to her when he visited, but even he intimidated Eleanor with his boisterous and bombastic manner. The trauma she had suffered made her painfully sensitive, fearful, and timid, and she increasingly identified with the family's opinion of herself as the ugly duckling. Eleanor's difficult childhood profoundly shaped her outlook on herself, the world around her, and her place in it. Personal loss and poor self-esteem cultivated in her a desire above all to be loved, but also a deep compassion for the trials and suffering of others. These experiences guided her toward a life of public service. Her conviction that she was not beautiful enough inspired her to develop her inner qualities. A kind and honest heart and a sharp intellect, she believed, were enough to make even the plainest woman attractive and worthy of love in the ways that counted most. This belief was strongly reinforced when, at age 15, Eleanor was sent to Allenswood Academy, a finishing school near London, England, in 1899. Her Aunt Bammy, who had attended the school herself, thought it an ideal fit. The school's headmistress, Madame Silvestre, became a strong mentor in Eleanor's life, encouraging independent thinking, social consciousness, and civic engagement. Eleanor later wrote that her 3 years at Allenswood were the happiest of her entire life. At last, she had like-minded friends who valued her for who she was. She was well-liked, even popular. It was therefore a bitter pill to swallow when her grandmother summoned her home in 1902 for her debut into New York society. At 17, Eleanor was eligible to be presented to society and for marriage. She later spoke of how miserable she found the experience of being a debutante, which is hardly surprising. She had few friends among the young people at her debut, having lived in England for so long. Moreover, debutantes were admired largely for their looks and poise, an idea that clashed with Eleanor's values after years at Allenswood, where substance mattered more than appearance. She did not forget the lessons she had learned, however, and soon became involved with the New York chapter of the Junior League. Over the next 2 years, she taught physical fitness and dance classes to children in low-income neighborhoods on New York's East Side. A few months before her 18th birthday, Eleanor began discreetly seeing her distant cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was 2 years her senior. They met by chance at the New York Horse Show at Madison Square Garden, and their correspondence soon blossomed into a romance. Each admired the other's ideals, intellect, and ambition. Eleanor hoped that marriage, expected of her by society, might finally bring happiness. Franklin proposed in November 1903, and Eleanor accepted. Unfortunately, Franklin's mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, strongly opposed the match and insisted that her son wait a year before announcing the engagement. Despite her efforts to persuade Franklin to break it off, he refused. Sarah's opposition and her tense relationship with Eleanor deeply wounded her. Eleanor had hoped her future mother-in-law would offer the maternal warmth she had long lacked, but this never came. Eleanor and Franklin were married at the Delano family estate in Newburgh, New York, on the 17th of March, 1905. President Theodore Roosevelt, Eleanor's uncle and Franklin's fifth cousin, gave the bride away. At the ceremony's conclusion, he kissed his favorite niece, slapped Franklin on the back, and joked about keeping the name in the family. The New York Times likened the wedding to a royal union between two scions of one of America's foremost aristocratic families. Sadly, Eleanor did not find married life to be all she had hoped. Strain appeared even before their European honeymoon ended. Although they loved, admired, and respected one another throughout their marriage, biographers suggest their friction stemmed from wanting each other to play roles neither could fulfill. Franklin, raised at the center of his mother's devotion, desired unquestioning adoration, something Eleanor, given to critical frankness, could not provide. Eleanor, having grown up without consistent affection, wanted to be loved for herself and to have a partner she could trust completely. Franklin, with loyalties divided among his wife, mother, family, and career, could not fully meet those needs. Eleanor also admitted she did not enjoy marital intimacy, viewing it as a duty rather than a joy. Nonetheless, the marriage produced 6 children in 10 years: Anna, James, Franklin, Elliot, Franklin Jr., and John. The early years of marriage were further strained by Eleanor's difficult relationship with Sarah Delano Roosevelt. After their honeymoon, the couple moved into a house adjoining Sarah's in New York. Sarah, who had been widowed while Franklin was still young, maintained an exceptionally close and proprietary relationship with her only son. Much of Eleanor's unhappiness stemmed from Sarah's constant interference and attempts to assert herself as the matron of the household. James, the eldest son, later recalled that their grandmother once insisted she, not Eleanor, was their real mother. Franklin was often absent due to his legal and political career, though he was affectionate and attentive when home. Eleanor, by contrast, later confessed that she struggled to understand or care for children and found it difficult to express affection. She admitted that motherhood did not bring her the secure happiness she had expected. Eleanor's relationship with her own mother had always been emotionally detached, and after Anna's death, she received little warmth from subsequent caregivers. It is also possible that her relationship with her rather domineering mother-in-law further reinforced her conviction of her own shortcomings as a parent. Sarah Delano Roosevelt was often critical of Eleanor's physical appearance, much as Eleanor's own mother had once been. Perhaps a more supportive environment in Eleanor's early life or during her early married years might have given her greater confidence, comfort, and joy, both in marriage and in motherhood. Before their first wedding anniversary, Eleanor confronted Franklin about her dissatisfaction with their home life. She later wrote that she did not like living in a house that was not in any way hers, one in which she had no say and which did not reflect how she wished to live. She had played no role in choosing or decorating the family home, and Sarah maintained full supervision over all domestic activities. Franklin reassured Eleanor that she would settle in with time, but few changes were made, and Eleanor grew increasingly dissatisfied. One of the few places she felt truly at home was her children's cottage, a charmingly simple and rustic dwelling on the family's holiday estate at Campobello Island in New Brunswick, Canada. It was there, during a family vacation in 1909, that the young Roosevelt family suffered a painful tragedy. Their third son, Franklin, not yet a year old, died after a short illness related to a heart condition. Eleanor was devastated and blamed herself, believing that the child had been left too often with nurses and nannies, and that had she been a better mother, she might somehow have saved him. The shared loss softened Eleanor's relationship with Sarah somewhat. Thereafter, Sarah tried to be warmer and more supportive toward her daughter-in-law, though she never entirely relinquished her proprietary attitude toward her son's family or her criticism of Eleanor. Less than a year after losing baby Franklin, Eleanor gave birth to her fourth child, Elliot, followed by two more sons, Franklin Jr. and John, over the next 5 years. Yet Eleanor endured further pain and resentment when, 2 years after the birth of their last child, she discovered that Franklin had been engaged in a long-term affair with her social secretary, Lucy Mercer. It also emerged that Franklin had discreetly explored the possibility of divorcing Eleanor, a prospect immediately vetoed by both his mother and his political advisors. Divorce, they believed, would destroy Franklin's career and disgrace the family. Sarah even threatened her son with disinheritance. It was around this time that the Roosevelt marriage began to fundamentally evolve. For the rest of her life, Eleanor remained deeply hurt by Franklin's infidelity. Lucy Mercer was beautiful, young, gentle, and adored Franklin in the unquestioning manner Eleanor could not provide. The affair seemed to confirm Eleanor's fear that she would never be loved in the way she longed for, and that she would always exist on the outer perimeter, even within her own family. At the same time, Eleanor was intensely practical. She resolved to cultivate the best possible relationship with Franklin, one that became primarily a political and public service partnership. It nevertheless retained a close intimacy based on shared history, mutual respect, admiration for one another's intellect and emotional strength, and a deep desire for each other's approval. Franklin's affairs continued discreetly throughout their marriage. Lucy Mercer remained an intermittent presence in his romantic life, and he also developed a prolonged relationship with his longtime secretary, Marguerite "Missy" LaHand. Though deeply hurt, Eleanor was in some ways liberated by the new status quo of her marriage. Eleanor belonged to a generation and social class in which divorce was exceedingly rare. Instead, unhappy couples often arrived at private arrangements, leading largely separate lives while maintaining a public image of unity. The Roosevelt marriage was closer than most such arrangements, and when apart, Franklin and Eleanor corresponded almost daily. Increasingly, however, Eleanor found herself living two lives. There was her public role as wife, mother, and social reformer, and then her private life, largely separate from her family, in which she formed several intense romantic relationships over the course of her life, both during her marriage and after Franklin's death. Those close to the Roosevelts often lamented their seemingly unhappy marriage. Franklin's cousin Daisy once remarked on the tragedy that two such admirable individuals did not get along better. Still, Eleanor and Franklin remained a solid family unit. When Franklin was stricken with polio in 1921, Eleanor devoted herself completely to his care and recovery. She also wholeheartedly supported and defended his decision to continue pursuing a political career against the wishes of his mother, who preferred that he retire to a quieter life. Franklin, inspired by the legacy of his cousin President Theodore Roosevelt, remained ambitious, and Eleanor soon became one of his most important advisors. She took over some of Franklin's political engagements and began delivering speeches in support of his candidacy and initiatives. Biographers have described Eleanor as Franklin's social conscience. Unlike many political operatives, she personally visited communities to witness firsthand how people lived and worked, guided by empathy and compassion rather than political calculation. Her honest assessments proved invaluable, allowing Franklin to understand how policies functioned in practice and what reforms were truly needed. Most importantly, Eleanor offered her evaluations free from concern about political consequences, focusing solely on the public good. During the First World War, Franklin served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President Woodrow Wilson, though he did not see active combat. Eleanor worked with the Red Cross throughout the war years, and despite lingering fears rooted in her childhood experiences, visited and assessed veterans' hospitals to better understand the psychological trauma endured by returning soldiers. She later regarded this work as a lesson in confronting fear directly and emerging stronger. By her mid-30s, with her childbearing years behind her, Eleanor devoted increasing energy to social reform and began gaining a public reputation that paralleled her husband's rising political influence. She formed close professional and personal relationships with women active in the Democratic Party and engaged in numerous charitable, educational, social justice, and labor reform initiatives. Eleanor became involved with the League of Women Voters, befriending prominent reformers such as Esther Lape and Elizabeth Reed, and working alongside them for progressive causes. Along with many other American women, Eleanor voted for the first time in the election of 1920. Through her work with the Women's Trade Union League, she advocated for improved living and working conditions in low-income urban areas, championing reforms such as a minimum wage, a 48-hour work week, and the abolition of child labor. With close friends Marion Dickerman and Nancy Cook, Eleanor helped establish the Todd Hunter School for Girls in New York, where she taught history and literature for 3 years. Her teaching emphasized independent thought and social responsibility, echoing the lessons she had learned at Allenswood. In 1927, the three women also founded Val-Kill Industries, which provided employment to impoverished rural families producing handcrafted furniture and home goods. Together, they campaigned for Democratic presidential candidate Alfred E. Smith in 1924 and 1928. At the same time, Eleanor campaigned tirelessly for Franklin's successful bid for governor of New York in 1928. Following his victory, the family moved into the governor's mansion in Albany. These activities helped Eleanor forge an independent identity beyond her roles as wife and mother, even as she remained closely connected to her family. Her growing public life also diminished the influence of her mother-in-law's criticism, which had largely been exerted within the domestic sphere. Predictably, Sarah disapproved of Eleanor's reform work and new friendships, believing she should have returned fully to domestic life after the war. To Eleanor, the idea of resuming a life of socialite domesticity seemed a dull waste of time and energy. She later reflected that during her early marriage, she had lived according to her mother-in-law's pattern and later her children's. Now, she was ready to pursue a more independent and meaningful path of her own. She and Franklin commissioned the construction of a separate workspace and cottage in Hyde Park, a short distance from the Roosevelt Springwood estate and apart from the family home. This allowed Eleanor a space where she could work, entertain friends, and truly make the place her own. Val-Kill Cottage eventually became Eleanor's permanent residence during the difficult years following Franklin's death. As Eleanor's involvement in Franklin's political career increased, alongside her own growing projects, she began to travel far more frequently after Franklin's election as governor. Fiercely independent, she preferred to travel alone and often drove herself in her own car. Her extensive travel prompted Franklin to hire a bodyguard for her. In 1929, Earl Miller, a former New York State trooper, joined the Roosevelt household. Young, fair-haired, handsome, and personable, Earl quickly formed a close bond with Eleanor, who was 44 at the time, while he was 32. The precise nature of their relationship remains uncertain, but Eleanor's biographers generally agree that for at least several years, their bond was romantic. Earl remained one of her closest and most intimate friends for the next 3 decades, until Eleanor's death. The ambiguity surrounding their relationship stems largely from the fact that the many letters they exchanged over 30 years have been lost. It is believed these letters were either intentionally destroyed or discreetly purchased and sealed within a private collection shortly before Eleanor's death. Whatever the exact nature of their relationship, scholars believe Earl Miller was likely Eleanor's first serious romantic involvement since the painful discovery of Franklin's infidelities a decade earlier, experiences that had dealt a severe blow to her self-esteem. Being loved for herself by someone who expected nothing more than that she simply be herself likely restored a measure of confidence Eleanor had long lacked. This emotional renewal enabled her to move more boldly into public life and pursue fulfillment on her own terms, much as Franklin always had. When Franklin won the presidency in 1932, Eleanor approached the role of First Lady with some reluctance. Although she had been deeply engaged in public service for many years, she was apprehensive about the substance of the position itself. Traditionally, First Ladies held minimal responsibility and limited public visibility, serving primarily as domestic hostesses in the White House. Eleanor Roosevelt radically expanded the role of First Lady, becoming one of the most influential and widely admired women ever to hold the position. Her continued political engagement during Franklin's presidency stemmed in part from the fact that she had already been performing such work for years. Unlike previous First Ladies who abandoned their own ambitions upon entering the White House, Eleanor refused to retreat from public life. For example, Lou Henry Hoover, a committed feminist activist before her husband's presidency, distanced herself from such causes once she became First Lady. Edith Wilson, who assumed administrative responsibilities after President Woodrow Wilson suffered a debilitating stroke, did so discreetly to conceal her husband's condition. Eleanor, by contrast, acted openly and assertively, while also helping Franklin shoulder responsibilities made difficult by his illness, thereby minimizing public awareness of his disability. Eleanor had changed profoundly since the early years of her marriage and Franklin's illness. No longer awkward or self-doubting, she drew confidence from her friendships, political experience, and commitment to reform. These factors empowered her to be more active and influential in public life than any First Lady before her. During the final months of Franklin's 1932 campaign, Eleanor met Lorena Hickok, a journalist assigned by the Associated Press to cover the candidate's wife. The two women formed an intense and enduring bond that lasted the rest of Eleanor's life. Biographers report that Lorena fell deeply in love with Eleanor. Finding herself unable to write about the First Lady with impartiality, she resigned from journalism and joined the White House staff. Eleanor and Hick, as she affectionately called her, were constant companions throughout the 1930s and early 1940s. When separated, they wrote long, emotionally charged letters, sometimes daily and as long as 15 pages. Many of these letters survive, making Eleanor's relationship with Hickok clearer than her relationship with Earl Miller. Despite the evident passion expressed in these letters, historians have long hesitated to describe the relationship as romantic. Eleanor once wrote, "I cannot kiss you, so I kiss your picture good night and good morning," and expressed her longing to see Hickok, assuring her that no one else in the world meant as much to her. Some historians caution against drawing conclusions about romantic or sexual intimacy that cannot be definitively proven,
or against assigning a sexual identity Eleanor never claimed for herself. Others argue that the language of the letters unmistakably reflects romantic love, noting that similar expressions between a man and a woman would rarely be questioned. Eleanor belonged to a generation that rarely articulated sexual identity openly. While same-sex relationships were not uncommon, women often lived together in arrangements known as Boston marriages. Heteronormativity dominated public life. It was known among the White House press corps that Lorena Hickok was a lesbian, yet historians traditionally characterized her relationship with Eleanor as an exceptionally close friendship. As a married woman with children and one of the most famous women in the world, Eleanor could not have openly acknowledged a romantic relationship with another woman. It is also possible she never defined her sexual orientation in modern terms. Nevertheless, she formed deep romantic relationships and close friendships with several lesbian women, including Esther Lape and Elizabeth Reed of the League of Women Voters, as well as her Val Kill partners Marion Dickerman and Nancy Cook. Her beloved mentor, Madame Souvestre of Allenswood, was also known to have been a lesbian.
At the same time, Eleanor had romantic relationships with men and maintained close friendships across sexual identities throughout her life. This aspect of her private life remains one of the most debated and complex dimensions of her biography. Whatever her sexual identity, Eleanor sought fulfillment in her personal relationships while continuing to operate within the heteronormative framework of her marriage and family. More broadly, Eleanor often worked in the space between social acceptance and controversy to effect meaningful change. Another lesser-remembered dimension of Eleanor Roosevelt's life was her feminism. Feminist scholars have often overlooked her role, largely because she does not fit neatly into the conventional historical periods of feminist movements. She was not a central figure in the suffrage movement, nor did she live to see the height of second-wave feminism in the 1960s, having died in 1962. Yet, Eleanor's contributions in the intervening years were substantial. Her feminism was more left-leaning than that of many middle-class reformers, focusing on labor justice, economic equality, and the rights of working-class women. Above all, she advocated fiercely for women laborers and against child labor, leaving a lasting impact on social reform in 20th century America. More middle-class feminists later expressed resentment toward Eleanor Roosevelt for her opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment during the early 20th century. Eleanor's objection to the proposed constitutional amendment, however, was rooted in her belief that it would ultimately disadvantage working-class women and their families. Instead, she advocated initiatives such as subsidized childcare programs and expanded public education to help working women shoulder the dual burdens of wage earning and child rearing, concerns that middle and upper-class women were far less likely to face. Eleanor worked diligently to influence her husband's New Deal programs, striving to ensure that women would not be underserved and would be offered the widest possible range of employment opportunities. As First Lady, Eleanor held more than 350 press conferences at the White House during Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. Inspired by Lorena Hickok, she restricted these events to women reporters only, since only male journalists were permitted to attend the president's press conferences. Both Eleanor and Hickok understood that this policy would encourage newspapers to hire more women reporters. Although she was cautioned against discussing specific policies reserved for Congress or the presidency, Eleanor openly expressed her views on social, economic, and political issues important to her. Her aim was to promote communication, public awareness, and greater civic engagement among women. Much like Franklin's fireside chats, Eleanor skillfully used the media to connect with the public and encourage social and political mobilization. Throughout much of her husband's presidency, Eleanor wrote a daily newspaper column titled My Day, in which she discussed current events, social issues, and offered advice to readers. She also authored a monthly magazine column, If You Ask Me, initially conceived to familiarize the public with the Roosevelts in the White House. Eleanor frequently used this platform to address serious topics such as economics and international peace that were rarely covered in mainstream women's publications. Beginning in 1940, she also hosted a nationally syndicated radio program, Mrs. Roosevelt's Own Radio Program, which aired weekly on NBC. From 1932 onward and throughout the rest of her life, Eleanor published numerous books and essays and delivered hundreds of public speeches, most in support of democratic values and progressive causes. Considering her extensive press conferences, speeches, publications, and the countless letters she wrote daily, it is reasonable to regard Eleanor Roosevelt as one of the most prolific women writers of the 20th century. When criticized for being overly outspoken, even for publicly disagreeing with her husband, Eleanor remained undeterred. She insisted that she raised controversial issues deliberately to bring them into mainstream discussion, thereby increasing public awareness and potentially inspiring action. Most impressively, she donated all proceeds from her sponsored publications and paid speaking engagements to charitable causes she supported. Eleanor worked closely with Harry Hopkins to oversee the fair and effective implementation of the New Deal programs during the Great Depression. She was especially invested in the National Youth Administration, which sought to provide employment for young Americans aged 16 to 24. One of her most personal projects was the planned community of Arthurdale near Morgantown, West Virginia. Lorena Hickok, who had investigated conditions in the region on behalf of Secretary of Commerce Harry Hopkins, encouraged Eleanor to visit Morgantown to witness firsthand the devastating effects of the Great Depression. Eleanor was deeply affected by the plight of the town's residents, many of whom were unemployed miners blacklisted for union activity. Adequate housing, food, and clean water were scarce, and some families shared their homes with livestock or even slept in caves and culverts. Determined to help, Eleanor envisioned relocating the town's residents into a planned community that might eventually become self-sustaining. Franklin enthusiastically supported the idea, making Arthurdale a New Deal project. Eleanor invested nearly all of her personal income into the initiative. Although some historians later labeled Arthurdale a failure and the government sold off the remaining land by 1942, Eleanor took satisfaction in seeing many families regain financial stability and independence as a result of the program. Her experience with planned communities revealed to Eleanor that while the New Deal was helping many Americans, its benefits were not distributed equally. Residents of several such communities, including Arthurdale, refused to admit African American or Jewish families. Eleanor was shocked to learn that a planned community established in West Virginia the year before Arthurdale, ironically named Eleanor in her honor, was a sundown town where people of color risked harassment, arrest, or violence if they remained after dark. Initially hoping to create diverse communities, Eleanor was deeply disheartened when white residents consistently voted to restrict residency to white Christians only. These defeats prompted her to become far more active and outspoken in the civil rights movement. When she realized that racism was limiting African Americans' access to New Deal benefits, Eleanor pressured the administration to revise its policies to better serve Black Americans. Despite her efforts, only about one-third of African Americans in need received adequate support from the New Deal. Determined to do more, Eleanor cultivated close working relationships and friendships with prominent Black leaders such as Walter White, chairman of the NAACP, and Mary McLeod Bethune, a renowned educator and activist. Under the Roosevelt administration, more African Americans were appointed to federal positions than under any previous administration, and a more comprehensive advisory system on civil rights was established within the White House. Nevertheless, Franklin Roosevelt depended politically on Southern segregationist lawmakers who wielded considerable power in Congress. As a result, he declined to publicly support federal anti-lynching legislation despite widespread racial violence in the South since the late 19th century. Segregationist politicians condemned anti-lynching bills as violations of states' rights. Franklin even refused to meet Walter White to discuss the legislation. Eleanor responded by personally inviting White to the White House for tea, ensuring that the president would also be present. Both Eleanor and White were deeply disappointed by Franklin's unwillingness to publicly support the bill, despite his private assurance that he would sign it if Congress passed it. While Franklin's support for civil rights remained constrained by political considerations, Eleanor became increasingly vocal and active in the movement. Her advocacy drew many African American voters away from the Republican Party and into the Democratic Party. She devoted herself to expanding educational opportunities, ending segregation, and improving living conditions for Black Americans throughout the remainder of her life. One of her most iconic public gestures was her support for the Black opera singer Marian Anderson, whom the Daughters of the American Revolution refused to allow to perform in Washington, D.C. due to segregation. Eleanor, a longtime member of the organization, resigned in protest and arranged for Anderson to perform on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Anderson's performance of My Country 'Tis of Thee remains one of the most powerful and enduring moments in 20th century American history. When World War II broke out, Eleanor Roosevelt found ways to support the war effort while still maintaining her commitment to domestic social reform. She visited American troops and conducted inspections in England in October 1942, and in November 1943, she traveled to various American military posts throughout the South Pacific. Wherever she went, she drew large and admiring crowds, and her speeches and personal warmth were widely praised. Admiral William Halsey initially greeted the prospect of her visit with resentment, complaining that he had no time to chaperone a do-gooder seeking a photo opportunity. By the end of her visit, however, he openly praised Eleanor's conduct and her genuine concern for the well-being of the men serving under his command. When Eleanor inspected a facility, she did far more than cut a ribbon, shake a few hands, and leave. She took time to speak with as many people as possible. In military hospitals, she spoke briefly with nearly every patient on the ward. Many GIs later recalled Mrs. Roosevelt warmly greeting them, asking whether they were being treated well, whether they had everything they needed, and whether there was anything she could do for them. On the home front, Eleanor advocated strongly for expanded employment opportunities for women and African Americans in wartime industries, particularly in manufacturing and skilled trades. She believed deeply that everyone deserved the chance to contribute meaningfully and to benefit economically from their service. She also provided personal and financial support to expand the pilot training program at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, a historically Black college and trade school. Eleanor helped finance the construction of Moton Airfield and supported the creation of the first all-Black unit of fighter pilots, later known as the Tuskegee Airmen. Like many others, Eleanor emerged from the war profoundly changed by what she had witnessed and deeply mournful of the lives lost. The brutality of the conflict, inflicted not only on soldiers but also on civilians and refugees, especially European Jews, strengthened her resolve to push the United States toward greater responsibility in caring for refugees fleeing Nazi persecution. One of her greatest personal sorrows was her failure to persuade Franklin Roosevelt, his administration, or Congress to reconsider their rejection of most Jewish refugees. She was also unable to convince her husband to halt Executive Order 9066, which authorized the internment of approximately 110,000 Japanese Americans during the war. On April 12, 1945, Franklin Roosevelt died of a cerebral hemorrhage at his home in Warm Springs, Georgia, known as the Little White House. Eleanor had not been summoned during his final days. She later learned from her eldest daughter, Anna, who had been caring for Franklin, that Eleanor's former social secretary and Franklin's longtime romantic interest, Lucy Mercer, now Lucy Rutherford, had been present instead, and that Franklin had discreetly continued seeing her for many years. Eleanor's grief over Franklin's death, combined with the pain of what felt like a final rejection, caused temporary tension between her and Anna. The two soon reconciled, however, and it would later be Anna who cared for Eleanor during her own final illness. After the war, Eleanor fully embraced internationalism, a worldview her husband had long held. The destructive conflicts of the early 20th century convinced her that comprehensive international cooperation was essential to world peace and human progress. Her work with the United Nations in the immediate post-war period, particularly her leadership in drafting and securing passage of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, stands among her greatest achievements. The Declaration incorporated Franklin Roosevelt's 4 freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want through economic security, and freedom from fear through personal safety. Eleanor served as chair of the UN Commission on Human Rights until 1953, devoting particular attention to addressing global hunger. She received numerous international awards and honors for her service to the United Nations and the cause of human rights, both during her lifetime and posthumously. Throughout the 1950s, Eleanor continued to champion progressive and humanitarian causes. She traveled extensively, delivered hundreds of speeches, and maintained her syndicated writing and broadcasting activities. Her tireless advocacy inspired millions to become more socially conscious and civically engaged. In 1999, a Gallup poll ranked Eleanor Roosevelt among the 10 most admired people of the 20th century. Despite her popularity, Eleanor was not universally admired. Her left-leaning, pro-labor and pro-civil rights positions earned her many political enemies. J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, was rumored to have kept extensive files on her, viewing her support for unions and civil rights as suspiciously close to communism. Segregationists and white supremacists blamed Eleanor's influence when racial riots erupted in Detroit in 1943, and Southern propagandists spread false rumors of organized groups of black domestic workers, so-called Eleanor clubs, supposedly terrorizing white employers. No evidence has ever been found that such groups existed. During her work at the United Nations, Eleanor met Dr. David Gurevich, the organization's first medical director. He became both her personal physician and one of her closest friends. After Franklin's death, some biographers described Eleanor's feelings toward David as romantic, though apparently unreciprocated. Eleanor was in her mid-60s, while David was nearly 20 years younger. The two traveled extensively together over the next decade as Eleanor pursued her many causes. David was deeply devoted to her, though he always addressed her formally as Mrs. Roosevelt.
When David became engaged to his future wife Edna, Eleanor initially feared losing his companionship. Instead, Eleanor and the Gureviches jointly purchased a spacious townhouse on East 60th Street in Manhattan, where the three lived together harmoniously until Eleanor's death a decade later. In 1960, President John F. Kennedy reappointed Eleanor Roosevelt to lead the American delegation to the United Nations and named her chair of the Commission on the Status of Women, which evaluated women's employment and educational opportunities and issued policy recommendations to promote gender equality. Kennedy also appointed her to a committee tasked with negotiating the release of American prisoners following the failed Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. Additionally, Eleanor played a key role in shaping President Kennedy's International Youth Service Initiative, later known as the Peace Corps. Eleanor's health began to decline in 1960 after she was diagnosed with anemia. Steroid treatments weakened her immune system and reactivated a dormant tuberculosis infection. Determined not to die in a hospital, she left professional medical care in mid-October 1962 and returned to her Manhattan home. She soon suffered a cerebral vascular stroke and died on November 7, 1962, at the age of 78. Eleanor Roosevelt was mourned across the nation and around the world. President Kennedy ordered flags lowered to half-mast at government buildings and diplomatic posts worldwide.
Her funeral was attended by 4 U.S. presidents: Harry Truman, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Lyndon B. Johnson, and John F. Kennedy, each paying tribute to her as one of the most remarkable and beloved women of the 20th century. She was laid to rest beside Franklin Roosevelt in the Rose Garden at their Springwood estate in Hyde Park, now the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. In his eulogy, Adlai Stevenson famously said of her, "She would rather light a candle than curse the darkness, and her glow has warmed the world." What do you think of Eleanor Roosevelt? Let us know in the comments below, and as always, thank you very much for watching.